Good morning and welcome to Hope, Faith, and Joy Daily Devotion with me, Pastor Amanda. We are looking at Exodus 14 today. So we are now into the flight of the Israelites, or maybe the escape of the Israelites, as they have now approached the Red Sea. And we find out at the very beginning of chapter 14 that the Lord tells Moses where they are to camp. So where they are to stop, and it's kind of important in the sense that what God's doing here is setting up another moment in time to show God's glory. And we find out that God is about to do something again in order that God's glory, God's power and might shall be demonstrated within this act. And so we have a sense of which God's controlling some of the things going on here. But I think it's also important to realize, I think people also kind of walk right into some of God's plans, whether they mean to or not. Anyways, what happens here is now there's this illusion to the Egyptians that the Israelites have walked themselves into a corner, so to speak. They are now trapped between this sea that they could drown in and the camp or the Egyptian army. And so it looks like to Pharaoh that the Israelites have got themselves into a tight spot, so to speak. And so, what we find out is that now Pharaoh has gathered up his army and he is going out boldly, it tells us. And with all of these horses and chariots, and I mean, there's just this intensity of what's coming after the Israelites. So much so that the Israelites then say to Moses, was it because there were no graves in Egypt that you have taken us away to die in the wilderness? What have you done to us, bringing us out of Egypt? Is this not the very thing we told you Egypt? Told you in Egypt, let us alone and let us serve the Egyptians? For it would have been better for us to serve the Egyptians than to die in the wilderness. So the Israelites immediately blame Moses for their situation. And it's just kind of interesting. I just started a new Bible study, book study last night. And it's called The Emotionally Healthy Spirituality by Peter Scorsese. I think I said that wrong, but close enough. But anyways, what it's all about is unhealthy communications that happen. And right here is prime time. Right here, there is uh, uh unhealthy because instead of looking to God in this moment, because God's the one who brought the plagues, God's the one who told Moses to do all this, like God's been this primary focus in what's going on here, and they blame Moses in their time of fear. They've got to blame somebody. They can't take responsibility for their own decisions, their own choices, their own belief and everything. And so we just see this unhealthy sense that they're playing out in this. And of course, what happens then, of course, Moses then has to reassure them, do not be afraid, stand firm, and see the deliverance that the Lord will accomplish for you today. Moses is having to remind them, wait, God's in control here, not me. Like, you gotta, this is bigger than us. He reminds them that the Lord will fight for them and everything. And it's also kind of interesting in verse 15. It says here that the Lord said to Moses, why do you cry out to me? Tell the Israelites to go forward. There's this point in which God's like, I have done this, and this. where's your part in this? Where is it that you're putting your foot forward in trusting what I am doing? And I think that's something all of us have to struggle with on probably a daily basis of where is our action meeting God's action? Because God's action has gone before us. And so where is our trust that God's going to keep providing promises? So often we're like, all of a sudden, here we are, how many thousands of years later, and we're still like, well, God's not going to do God's part. And it's like, wait, God's been doing God's part for thousands of years, and all of a sudden we think God's going to stop. And so it causes us to kind of think, where do we need to put our faith into some action, into what God's already doing in our lives? So, anyways, God's like, stretch out your hand with your staff and open up, and you will divide the sea. And so we have this kind of creation moment again, where there's the control over the waters and bringing forth the land. And we find that Moses is able to kind of divide the waters. There's a wind that goes in that dries the land. And then also the pillar the cloud pillar and the fire pillar that had been guiding the Israelites now goes from in front of them to behind them to kind of create a screen so that the Egyptians don't really know what's happening on the other side. There's this separation, but it's also kind of cool to see how God is there to protect them in their situation. God goes before us and God comes behind us. In a sense, God's going to clean up whatever's behind them. And so we see this how God's got this movement of going before them and behind them. And of course, then as the Israelite people begin to cross over, uh, Pharaoh follows behind them, and the waters then Moses has said, put your staff back up within your hand, and then the waters will subside, will come back down. And so we see that again, so that the returning of the waters, this power over creation again, and we're told at the end of this that thus the Lord saved Israel that day from the Egyptians, and Israel saw the Egyptians dead on the seashore. Israel saw the great work that the Lord did against the Egyptians. So the people feared the Lord and believed in the Lord and in his servant Moses. I love this point. They feared the Lord, they believed in the Lord, they believed in Moses. But how long is it gonna last? And this is going to be an ongoing issue about how their faith wavers so quickly. But for us today, we can kind of take from this, where do we need to step out in action for where God's already at work in our lives? What steps are we needing to take to say, hey, we trust what you're doing? And maybe it's time to question, where have we started already? Where are we falsely blaming others for our situations? When maybe that's exactly the situation God needs us in right now. Maybe there's something we should be doing in that situation instead of blaming somebody else for where we are. It's kind of deep for today. But then, of course, always recognizing how God is going before us and behind us in so many situations. And so there's a lot to think about today and reflect on from this scripture today. So thanks for joining me today with Pastor Amanda with Hope, Faith, and Joy Daily Devotion. I'll see you in the morning.